Hi, Converge. We're continuing our like little mini closure series on prayer. Last week we talked about unanswered prayer and different ideas around that, why that happens, and just what the position we should take for ourselves in our walk with God when we come to that. When we're talking, we kept alluding to grief and lament. Usually, when unanswered prayer comes, right, because we're hurt. From whatever we've been praying about, what desires we've been giving to God. And so grief and lament is kind of the next topic. So Tammy, when we talk about grief and lament, what does that look like in our prayer life?
It's interesting, I think, just to speak like maybe culturally first, like how our Western culture doesn't tend to lean into grief. We tend to push it away. I mean, think about, Keegan, like what message did you grow up hearing from culture when it comes to like, crying as a child?
Yeah. Like especially like for men, like you don't cry. That's not something that's really upheld in like school or anything. It's not cool to cry.
Even for me, like big girls don't cry. Right? That's the message. Now, there's no ill intent, I don't think, behind the messaging, but it does give us the cultural message that grief in the form of tears or being in control of all of your emotions all the time is what is valued, right? Where I think that we need to look a little deeper and see what we're feeling and sit with it, find out why, so that we can move through it. We don't have to push it away, which is what culturally I think a lot of us are taught to do. I don't know, is that your experience?
Yeah, I mean, like my own experience with like grief and lament as like a topic within Christianity was like really introduced. Like, I'm pretty sure my dad tried to introduce it to me, but I just totally didn't understand what he was talking about because lament's a big word, and like when you're like in middle school, who knows what that is?
Right.
But when I went into university and we talked about the topics of lament or just how emotions were viewed in like different cultures and stuff, I definitely noticed like the Western church doesn't have a great handle on how to like with God and like emotions and stuff like that. So I learned like in different cultures, lament's shown different ways, right? But it's totally like accepted within different cultures. There's some places where they'll literally cry at the altar, or different clothing will be used, right? Like in Israel, sackcloth was used, and so like that tradition actually still carries in some cultures today, or like certain aspects of mourning of the dead are brought into the church to symbolize like the feeling of death and stuff. So I think,
go ahead.
Well, that's like, I think that's really important to see that like God can handle your full range of emotions. Like that's what stood out to me. And then second is that while there's like these different ways of people showing their emotion to God in what we would classify as a negative emotion, that there isn't really that in the Western church. And I noticed like a lot of the worship songs we sing, even, or our contemporary worship songs, she'll preface, that do they like they highlight like the revelation that occurs after grief and lamenting instead of the like the pain that goes through it. I think a great example is like Job. Like Job states his questions, his doubts, and his problems to God, and still like says like God's still sovereign, but like this is a bunch of pooey, basically. And but then does like worship at the end of it when God's shown.
I think in our current context with the pandemic, there is a lot of grief and a lot of negative emotion that maybe people are either trying to push away because they don't want to feel hard things, difficult, negative, what we perceive as negative things. And they don't want to sit with it. And because there's no conclusion or end in sight, or a sense of going back to what we deemed as normal, that's not coming for a while, right? If it ever returns to the way it was. We just don't know that. I'm not saying it's not, but I think that it would be healthy for us to actually look at, how do we grieve with God? How do we lament? I mean, in scripture, you have a whole book of like lamentations, right? It's laments. Yeah. If you look at Psalms, there's David, and throughout the Psalms, there's different grieving prayers and songs and poetry. There's so much. And for me personally, I like to skip over the grieving part, the lament part, and go to but he's gonna fight my battle, but he's gonna win the war, but he's gonna, and I don't sit. I just quote that little bit at the end, and I don't sit in the lament part. And I wonder if right now that's the call for me personally, is to sit in the grieving and sit in the lament. I mean, for me personally, during this time of pandemic, we've had, family health issues happen. We lost our dog. My aunt passed away. And I'm starting to, but I have not spent a lot of time sitting with my grief, sitting and lamenting and just feeling it. I've spent a lot of time trying to push it away.
I think you just going forward and what we're going to talk about and giving tips about how to pray with grief and lament. I think that's the first step. For me, just being a healthy human being and also just a spiritual being is noticing the emotions that you're feeling and giving those to God and really asking God what can be found in the pain. I think is a great first step. What do you think could be continuing steps to be praying grief and lament? Because there's always, like we said, there's always hope, right? It's never a downward spiral, and we don't want to get that. And if that does happen, seek professional help from a counselor, just to preface, right? But what are some things with praying through? What would you recommend?
I think the first step is honesty, is being honest with exactly where we're at. But I think the next step is moving into sitting with God in the idea that I'm going to trust you. So just trusting that God can hold all of it. He can hold my grief, but at the same time hold my joy. He can hold the circumstances, and he can hold me. And just really sit with that idea that I can trust in God's ability to hold all of me. And if I am starting to go down the catastrophic thinking kind of path, recognizing that, being honest with that, and seeking help in community. We can talk to counselors, and I'm not ashamed, I see a counselor, but also being in community and talking about our grief in community, I think is a healthy thing. But then moving into the idea again that, but I'm going to trust, but I'm going to hope.
Yeah, and I think also there's varying stages of grief and loss too. Sure. And, some people are going to be dealing with greater heavier subjects, like we were talking about, death and sickness and life altering things. And then sometimes depending on where you're on the life, right, first or second half, sometimes it's how am I going to make ends meet, or what am I supposed to do with my life, or what's the next move? And I think sometimes it's not just like definitely working through those things, but sometimes it's also like a molding process to go through
Yeah.
it. And sometimes our grief and our lament is because of unanswered questions or unmet expectations, or just the mystery is just too great for us to handle sometimes. To what in the world is God actually doing in our lives and in the world, and becoming okay with a little bit of um, the ending to stuff, and okay with the mysteries, I think very important.
Yeah, absolutely. We look at, like I spoke about death for sure, but I even think about, how the fall is going to look for students trying to go back,
Yeah.
how it's going to look for parents and family members of students. Like there's an actual loss there that needs to be grieved in healthy and productive ways. So I think finding ways to do that is important. Finding ways to put into words, or using my body in prayer, whether it's through tears or journaling, is a great way to express your lament. Praying with someone, even sharing what you're experiencing with someone, and having that be a mutual kind of like sharing, and then praying together. So maybe not just staying there in the grief, acknowledge it, feel it, go move through it, but also offering it to God as, this is something difficult that I'm going through. It might be smaller to someone else, but it's kind of a bigger deal for me. And just trusting that God can handle it.
Yeah, and just from what you said, I think before we end, we should touch on that. That grief and lament can look different for each and every individual. And like when we talking about our pain, I think for the individual like that might be uncomfortable with that, it's important that you just like realize the pain. You don't need to say anything. You don't need to try to fix their problems. They're not asking for that, unless they blatantly ask like for your opinion. But just like sitting with them and like saying like, yeah, I understand, that sucks, but you know what, I'll be here with you through the whole entire day, is extremely important, and is what should be the initial thing said in a situation such as that.
I'm super thankful for the community that has come around me, even in this time when I'm experiencing grief. And like, I have a few friends who are, they're messaging me quite regularly just to see like, okay, how was today? As you're going through this process, I'm standing with you. How was today? Or how was your night? Or what was that experience like? And genuinely asking and genuinely listening, and not feeling like they have to give advice. But if they have, maybe some insight from God, even asking permission to say like, hey, I feel like, in my prayer, this scripture might be helpful for you. Is it okay if I share this with you? And that, gives, it builds trust for sure in community, but that's one of the things that's been helpful for me personally. And I also wanted to point to a scripture, Lamentations. We talked about tears. I'm just read Lamentations 2:18 in part, and it says, "Cry out to the Lord, let your tears flow like a river day and night. Give yourself no relief, your eyes no rest." Like, it's okay to say things like that. It's okay to pray things like that. My tears, in Psalms 42:3, my tears have been my food day and night, while men say to me all day long, where is your God? It's maybe go and read some of these Psalms and some of these laments and reformat what you believe about tears, shedding tears, and whether it's, indicative of strength or not. And giving yourself some permission, and giving the people around you permission to grieve, to lament, and also to experience hope.
No, that's
even if you might not feel it in the moment.
no, that's extremely important. And with that point, I think wraps up our second installment of our little series. Next week, we'll come back and we're going to talk about labyrinth prayer, and what labyrinth prayer is, and how you can also practice labyrinth prayer at home, and some different strategies to do that. So we'll see you next week.